I spent the entire night thinking about the photograph. I kept looking at the date written on the back, July 1999. I had been 9 years old, and beneath the date were those 4 words in my mother's handwriting. Before Sophie remembers everything. I had no memory of anyone named Laura being part of my childhood, yet the photograph proved that she had been there. The next morning, I returned to the library earlier than usual. I wanted to look through the old records again, but this time I wasn't searching for the mysterious woman. I was searching for my mother. Her name was Margaret. She had never worked at the library, but years ago she had donated several boxes of books and old community records. I remembered seeing her name in the library archives when I was younger. I had never thought anything of it. Now I wondered if there was something hidden among those records. I spent almost an hour going through old documents. Most of them were completely ordinary: community events, local organizations, school programs, photographs, old newspapers. Then I found something that made me stop. It was a newspaper clipping from July 1999. The article was about a small local charity event that had taken place near the railway station. There was a photograph. My mother was standing in the background, and beside her was Laura, the same woman I had seen outside the library. I looked at the photograph for a long time, but there was something else. In the corner of the picture stood a little girl, a girl with dark hair, a girl who looked exactly like me. I suddenly remembered the train, the fields outside the window, my mother's hands tightly clasped together, and another memory began to return. There had been a woman sitting several seats away from us. I couldn't remember her face, but I remembered her voice. Not the words, just the sound, soft, calm, familiar. I closed my eyes and tried to remember more. Nothing came. I decided to search for the charity event online. There wasn't much information. The organization no longer existed. Its office had closed years ago. But I found an old article mentioning that the event had been connected to a temporary children's program. The program had provided support to families going through difficult circumstances. That didn't make sense. My childhood had been ordinary. At least, that's what I believed. My parents had divorced when I was young, but my mother had always taken care of me. We had never been wealthy, but we had enough. There had never been a reason for me to be part of a children's support program. Unless there was something my mother had never told me. That thought stayed with me all day. After work, I went back to the park. I didn't know why. Maybe I hoped Laura would return. She didn't. Instead, I sat on the same bench where she had been sitting the previous day. I looked around. Everything seemed completely ordinary. Children were playing nearby. People were walking their dogs. Cars passed on the street. Nothing about the place suggested that it had anything to do with a secret from my childhood. Then I noticed something carved into the wooden bench. 2 initials, M and L, my mother's first initial, and Laura's. I ran my fingers over the old carving. It was deeply worn. It had probably been there for decades. I suddenly wondered how many times my mother had sat on that bench, and why. That night, I called my mother again. This time, I asked about Laura. There was a long silence. I immediately knew the name meant something to her. My mother eventually admitted that Laura had been an important person in her life, but she wouldn't explain why. She only told me that Laura had helped her during a very difficult period. I asked what had happened in 1999. Again, silence. Then my mother told me that I was too young to understand. That answer bothered me more than anything else. I wasn't 9 anymore. I was 35. Whatever had happened was no longer something that needed to be hidden from me. But my mother still refused to explain. The next morning, Laura came to the library again. This time she didn't leave. She sat at a table near the windows. I watched her from the front desk. She seemed tired, older than she had appeared before. At one point, she took a photograph from her handbag. She placed it on the table, then she simply waited. I walked toward her. She didn't look surprised. I sat across from her. She pushed the photograph toward me. I looked down. It was the same photograph from 1999, but there was another person in it. A man standing behind my mother. I recognized him immediately. It was my father. I hadn't seen him since I was a teenager. My parents' divorce had been difficult, and over the years, he had gradually disappeared from my life. I knew almost nothing about where he lived now, but there he was, standing behind my mother and Laura, and next to him was a little girl. Me. I looked closer. My father wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at me. There was something about his expression that I couldn't understand. Then I noticed the date. July 17th, 1999. My birthday. I remembered that day. Not clearly, but enough. I remembered a cake, a train station, my mother crying, and my father leaving. I had always believed those memories belonged to different days. Suddenly, I wasn't sure. Laura took another photograph from her bag. This one was different. It showed my mother holding my hand at the railway station. My father was standing several feet away, and beside him was Laura. On the back was another note. This time, it wasn't written by my mother. It said, "She deserves to know the truth when she is old enough." I felt a strange mixture of anger and sadness. For years, I had believed my childhood memories were simply incomplete. Now I understood that some of them had probably been deliberately kept from me. Laura finally explained why she had been watching me. She had been trying to decide whether I was ready. She had known my mother for years. She had promised her that she would never interfere with my life unless I began searching for the truth myself. I had done exactly that, without realizing it. Laura had seen me looking through the library records. She had recognized the photograph, and she had realized that the past was beginning to come back to me. But there was still one question. What exactly had happened in July 1999? Laura gave me one final photograph. It showed a small house outside the city. I didn't recognize it. Then I looked at the date, July 18, 1999, the day after my birthday. Suddenly, I remembered something. A blue gate, a garden, a woman standing beside a car, and myself sitting in the back seat. I remembered being taken somewhere. I remembered asking my mother where we were going. But after that, everything disappeared. Laura told me that the house still existed. She had never returned there. Neither had my mother. But she believed I needed to see it. Not because the house itself held the answer, because that was where the truth had begun. The next morning, I drove there. It took almost 2 hours. The town looked completely different from how I imagined it. The roads were quieter, the buildings were older, and the house from the photograph was still standing. The blue gate was gone, the garden had changed, but I recognized it. I knew immediately. I stood outside for several minutes before going any closer. Then I noticed a small plaque beside the entrance. The house had once belonged to a woman who ran the children's program mentioned in the newspaper, and beneath her name was another name. Laura. I suddenly understood. Laura hadn't simply been my mother's friend. She had worked there, and my mother had brought me to that house. But why? I entered the garden. Every step felt strangely familiar. Then I saw something that made me stop. A large tree stood near the back of the property. I remembered it. I remembered sitting beneath it. I remembered my mother kneeling beside me. And I remembered her telling me that everything was going to be fine. But there was another memory, one I had completely forgotten. My mother wasn't alone. Laura had been there too, and my father had been standing at the gate. I suddenly understood why my mother had been afraid of me remembering. The truth wasn't about something that had happened to me. It was about something my parents had done, and Laura had been there when it happened. I returned home that evening and found an old envelope waiting in my mailbox. There was no name on it, only my address. Inside was a single handwritten page. It was from my mother. She had finally decided to tell me everything, but she had left out one crucial detail. She wrote that the decision made in July 1999 had changed all 3 of our lives. And she warned me that my father had never told me his side of the story. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. If you want the complete truth, you have to find out why your father left that day. I read that sentence several times. Then I looked at the photograph Laura had given me. For the first time in more than 20 years, I realized something. My father hadn't simply disappeared from my life after the divorce. He had disappeared much earlier. And the day he left the railway station might have been the day everything truly changed. I knew what I had to do. I had to find him.